parsha that we touched on yesterday, but I told you we'll try to go a little deeper into today, and that is the concept called, literally it's called the Zaken Mamer, the rebellious elder. So any of you senior citizens joining us here today, don't get rebellious. Don't get rebellious. Now's not the time for that. We are going to try to understand what is this concept of rebellious elder. And in fact, in our parsha, we learn about, there's a clear instruction about following the instructions of the sages. Just a second, ladies and gents. I'm going to take a quick pause to see why the devices are not charging. We don't want that in mid-shiur we go dead. Hey, hold on a second. What? One is... Oh. Okay, I hope my computer doesn't die in the middle. But if it does, I apologize in advance. So, that's the basic question here. Hey, Jakey, welcome. The question is, where does the Torah end and the Rabbis begin? And of course, if the Torah tells us, and we saw already in last week's parsha, the concept of listening to the instructions of the sages, and the idea that there is an oral law, that Moshe tells us in the parsha, we read that God is telling him about the laws of slaughter, but we don't see anywhere in the Torah actually specific instructions about how to perform shechita, how to slaughter an animal. So if that's the case, where is it? And that is what our sages tell us is the oral law, that this was transmitted to Moshe when he was on Mount Sinai by God. And of course, this is something that was taught orally. That's why it's called the oral tradition. And with time, eventually, it was transcribed by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He realized as Jews are being dispersed and scattered around the world, it's about time that this better be actually written down, or else it's going to be forgotten. And pretty much up until this time, up until that point where Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi wrote down the laws, what we're going to discuss today was really where it was relevant. And that's really the question. Is halakha man-made? Is it something that the sages decided just to tell us these are the rules, these are the laws? Or is it divine? Or is it something in between? So that's what we're going to do, is understand this concept, the topic of the Zaken Mamre, the rebellious elder mentioned in our parsha, and the way legal dissent and subversion were treated in biblical times. And if we're going to understand that, and we're going to look at the structure of Jewish judiciary, the nature of how laws are derived, I think they call it exegesis, and just to understand where did the rabbinic laws come from. As I mentioned, this was oral law that was given to Moshe at Mount Sinai, but it was never written until Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi did so. So if we can understand how that all works, then we could get to understanding, well, can somebody dissent? Can somebody say they disagree? So that's really the idea. It is a complex concept. Don't disappear. We're going to try to delve into it from different angles. I have some interesting ideas I want to share with you. Some interesting stories from the Talmud I'd like to read to you, or read with you. And of course, to understand the extraordinary significance of our own role when we study Torah and we apply that Torah which we study. So what's the purpose of all the interpretation, and where there's different views and perspectives? What for? Since ancient times, Jewish jurisprudence has been shaped by Torah and by the sages. Of course, it's two different things, but they're inextricably connected. So the Torah has 613 laws. That's it. The 613 commandments, we'll look at it. I have Rambam in front of me. I'll read to you Rambam in a moment, how he delineates them. And then the truth is I have a shiur every Wednesday evening where we look at we learn the 613 laws of the Torah. There is 248 positive and 365 negative. And we look through them, we learn them, we understand them, we see their application. But beyond those 613 biblical laws, and there's only 613 biblical laws, beyond that, we have many more laws, probably thousands of more laws, but those thousands of laws are rabbinic. And we have to understand the difference. The distinction is probably one of the oldest sources of tension within the Jewish people. And, even in temple times, while under the Roman occupation in the land of Israel, which we discussed in recent weeks, there were splits in the Jewish community. There was a group called the Tzedukim, the Sadducites, and they did not accept and believe in any oral tradition. To them, there was only the Torah, and don't in any way try to add anything else. Don't mix in any rabbinic interpretation. And then there were the Prussian. They were more the rabbinic establishment, and those who followed them, their adherents. Okay, so there was already then a split. Okay? And the Tzedukim, the Sadducites, their fundamental approach was that we only accept what's written in the Torah. If it isn't in the Torah, I don't want to hear it. Who gave these rabbis the power to interpret Torah? This was a major debate back then. And the Tzedukim have pretty much dissipated. There were also the Karaites I've mentioned to you previously. I bumped into some Karaites here in Karaim in Joburg. I think they're mostly in Israel. But they're very scarce today, very limited. And of course, most Jews, regardless whether one is Ashkenaz or Sephardi, even you could say the other subgroups we have, Reform and Conservative, and then when the Orthodoxy, all the different denominations, for the most part, the core, the essence, not just the Torah, but I'm talking the Mishnah and the Talmud, from which the halachas are derived, that's strong. That's the core of Judaism, the fundamentals that we believe in. But I'm sure you've heard, how many times have we heard people dismissing whatever, that's just something the rabbis came up with. Right? What is it? What does it really mean? Right? Well, do the rabbis have an opinion? Can they just make up laws? Do we have to follow what they say? So, if we just look at the body of Jewish law, we see that certainly, look through the Mishnah and the Talmud, that the rabbis, the great sages throughout our history, indeed, they've come up with a lot of things, right? Most of our prayers are of rabbinic origin. And if you think about most of the blessings we say, right? I'm not sure, other than the Kohen entering the temple, if it is specific instruction in the Torah that we have to wash our hands. And certainly it doesn't say in the Torah that you have to light the Hanukkah candles. Okay? What about the prohibition of polygamy? We joked yesterday about that the polygamy was banned with the invention of the credit card. Right? According to Torah law, Abraham had 2 wives. Yitzchak only 1. Yaakov Avinu had 4 wives. Shlomo Melech, 1,000. Okay, many were concubines. But the point is that there are so many laws. And let's go into, for example, the laws of Shabbos. The Torah gives us Lamed Tes Malachos, 39 fundamental principles about Shabbos. But then there are many subcategories. So there are the Avos, which are the principal laws. And then there are the Tuldos, the offspring of those. And there are so many laws relating to observance of Shabbos and kosher and financial law and you name it. Hanukkah and Purim are both not biblical holidays. Well, in a sense, you could say Purim somewhat is more so because it is included in the canonized 24 books of the Torah. We have Megillah, Esther. But beyond those, Hanukkah certainly isn't. We discussed a few weeks ago the book of Maccabees, which was not included in the canonized law. It's not part of the Tanakh, not in our biblical scriptures. So when you go through Rambam and you list the 613 commandments, the biblical commandments, the laws of the Torah, there are thousands of more laws than those. But they are rabbinic. Or you could say that they are the oral law. Okay, there's still, besides for oral, other rabbinic laws. Electricity did not exist 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, at the time when we had a Sanhedrin, or even in the times of Maimonides. So with the invention of electricity, the sages had to use those fundamental principles that were already known and established, and how to apply those into modern times. And by the way, if you look at the very word halacha, what does halacha mean? Jewish law. Very nice. Halacha etymologically comes from the word halach, means to walk. That means with time. The laws don't change, but times change. And the law knows, if you understand the fundamentals of Jewish law, am I saying the word fundamental too much today? Then you know how to apply it into more modern inventions with time. So let's just look at this week's parsha. I'm going to pick up my Chumash here today. I got to use it for my phone. Let's look. It's in our parsha, Parsha Shoftim. The Torah mentions this. Let's just look at it. Chapter 17. I'm going to read a few verses here. I'm going to start with verse 8. Ki palei mimcha davar lamishpat. Remember, the portion of Shoftim is about laws. So it says, if a matter eludes you in judgment, ben dam ledam, ben din ledin, whether it is between blood and blood, between judgment and judgment, ben nega lenaga, divrei ribes b'sharecha, or between legion, words of dispute in your cities, what does the Torah say? V'kamta v'alisa lamakim. Then you should rise up and go up to the place. To which place? Av sheyichar Hashem elekecha bo, to the place that Hashem your God will chooses. Which place does God choose? We know it's already last week's parsha too. Jerusalem, and that was the seat of the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin. Of course, there were multiple courts of Jewish law. Right here in Johannesburg, we have a Beis Din. A court of Jewish law usually had a minimum of 3 judges sitting at ruling laws. When it came to capital punishment, they had to have a minimum. They had to have 23 judges. Only when it came to major matters of law that were affecting the entire population, whether it was a matter related to the king or just to the general population, then it was brought up to the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, to the Sanhedrin. Okay, it says the verse, and you should come to the Kohanim, to the Levim, to the judge who will be in those days, and v'darashta, you are going to seek counsel and advice, and they will tell you the words of judgment. Continuing, let's read the next. And you should do exactly according to the words that they tell you from that place, from the source of the Sanhedrin, from the Supreme Court, from Jerusalem. And you should observe, you should do everything that they instruct you. Now we're not done yet, let's just continue. According to the Torah, or according to the law, it's probably a better way to understand this, that they instruct you. It says the verse, Moshe Rabbeinu is telling the Jewish people as they're entering the land of Israel, the laws that they have to know. That's what you should do. You should not digress, you should not diverge from anything they tell you. Not right, not left. And let's just conclude with one more verse. And if any person is to not listen, to argue with, to dissent from these words, whether it's from the Kohen, from the priest, or from the judge, then there is capital punishment. You should exterminate evil from Israel. Quite serious what it's telling us here. You have to listen to the rabbinic instructions. Rabbinic instruction is not me, but rather the great sages of Israel. The question that's being asked here, is there a halacha that tells we must not turn on interest and not use phone on Shabbat? This is exactly what the sages, using internet or phone on Shabbat, this is exactly what the law is telling us here. We follow what the sages tell us. So these are matters that would be discussed by a rabbinic court, and this is something that has to be discussed by the sages. How do we apply the ancient laws to contemporary times? Right? So this is something they're going to analyze the law. These are people who are well versed in Jewish law. And that's precisely what their job is. And the Torah is saying, listen to them. But if you look at this verse, we're not only talking here about us listening to the sages. I want you, without getting into the weeds just yet, the Torah is telling us that if you have a matter of legal doubt, we have to obviously consult with the sages. So you want to know, how do we apply those ancient laws to modern times? For sure, you have to consult with the sages. Okay? That's the simple understanding. But if the Torah is telling us that we have to follow the sages, wouldn't it mean that all rabbinic law is in fact scriptural law? Thank you. Thank you for a coffee this morning. That's so sweet of you. Right? Is there a difference between the rabbinic law and the sages? Okay? So that's what we're going to try to understand today. The nature, the source of rabbinic authority. And hopefully we could comprehend, we could grasp what the reverence that we have for the great sages who taught us the laws. This isn't just simply made up. You have to understand where the law comes from. So, my friends, with that in mind, let's go into it. We have to understand the sages are consulted if we don't know. If it's not clearly written in the Torah. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah if you're allowed to use internet or a phone on Shabbos, right? Doesn't say so. So how do we know? Well, the verse here says, consult with the sages. So this is where you have to know, how do the sages come up with these laws? What's the nature of rabbinic authority? And so to better understand the place and the power of rabbinic interpretation, my friends, join with me on this journey. Let's take a closer look at the laws as the verse says here in our parsha. And we have to understand there's a particular personality called a Zaken Mamre. Okay? And this will help us if we understand the concept of this Zaken Mamre. Don't worry, I'll put my next slide up. I don't have a lot of slides today. I was on the road. Being on the road makes it easier and harder to prepare for shiurim. In general, these days, life is getting a little bit busier, so it's harder to prepare as many slides as other times. But we'll do our best. So on the road, I'm driving. I was with the kids. The game reserve, so it's a little bit harder to prepare. But at the same time, I think this is very interesting. And with this, the truth is, this is a continuation of some of our recent classes where we talked about smicha and things like that. So it will fit into ideas that we've previously discussed. So let's understand what's the Zaken Mamre, the rebellious elder. And before we can understand how we deal with dissent, with an opposing opinion, we first have to understand, the concept, the process of the judicial system that the Torah tells us. Let's go back since the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. What was the law? We talked about the Sanhedrin, right? The Supreme Court had 71 sages. It was a 71 judges who presided over any cases that came to them. And there was one chief called the Nasi, right? Who was the first Nasi in Jewish history? Moshe Rabbeinu himself. And beneath this Supreme Sanhedrin, you had all the other Jewish courts in various, I don't know exactly how many there were around Israel, but you had smaller Supreme Courts. You could say perhaps by jurisdiction, by province. They each had their own 23-member courts. And then you had the smaller Sanhedrins within each city. So these smaller courts, especially the 23-member ones, they had broad powers. Okay, they brought to them literally almost all the multi-important laws came to them. Only major cases went up all the way to the Sanhedrin itself. Excuse me. So that's just a little bit about that. If I'm looking here, my notes, Rambam discusses it in great detail, but I'm not gonna go into all the details of how Rambam tells us. For example, it says that they would decide if this is the law. But the main point is the Torah tells us Acharei Rabbi Mahatas. How was a law decided? First of all, it always had to be an odd number of judges because the law is to follow the majority. And only once the majority reached their opinion, I guess you could have the appeals until it got to the top Sanhedrin. Maybe there were times when the king was able to interfere, but I don't think there were very many such times at all. Once the majority of the court, once you had the majority ruling, that's it. It became binding. That was the law. Okay, and that's what we read in the verse before. The Torah says that you should do according to what they tell you. You should observe and do according to everything they instruct you. That was the law. You had to follow what they wanted, what the majority of the sages said. Hi, Khali. Manti, do you have a question? I see I'm muted.
No. No.
Yeah?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna put it on mute then. Okay.
Yeah, please.
So here's the basic point. The basic point was you had to follow the majority. Once they told you what to do, the verse says very clearly that's what you have to follow. And everyone, not only the common folk, not only the general population and citizens of the country. The Torah says even the learned few. I don't mean learned few. I mean even these very sages themselves, who were themselves qualified to render halachic decisions, even they had to follow the majority rule. So if you had a court of 23 judges and 12 felt this way and 11 felt that way, the 11 had to concede to the 12 because that's the majority. That's it. There was one exception. The exception was an instance where there was unanimity. Do you know that they couldn't execute somebody? You couldn't actually give someone capital punishment if there was unanimous decision. The Rabbi discussed this concept, why that was. And the simple answer, he said, is how is it possible that a whole court of 71 judges or 23 judges, nobody found any merit in this individual? Something's wrong. Something has to be wrong if that's the case. But just looking at this instance, let me read to you what Rambam talks about. If you do have a dissenter, you have somebody, this is what we call the Zaken Mamre. Zaken literally means an elder, a senior citizen, who's Mamre, who's rebelling, who's dissenting. Now, the reason is because the sages were called Zaken in general. The concept that I wrote my dissertation on this, Zaken, an elder in Jewish law, is one has to be revered. Why? Zaken zeshekana chachma. A senior is somebody who's acquired wisdom. So it's a wise person. We deal with wise people, but can wise people not disagree? Let's understand the law. Says Rambam as follows. The Zaken Mamre, a rebellious elder, if you have a senior citizen, again, not necessarily a senior citizen. Careful, Michal, you're going to spill the coffee. It's going to break the computer. I won't have a computer anymore. Don't do that. The Zaken Mamre, the rebellious elder that the Torah mentions, is one of the sages of Israel. So remember, it says here, you have to accept the ruling. We're not just talking about the citizens who have to accept the ruling. We're saying here that even the sages, even the other sages who are on the Supreme Court, who are members of the Sanhedrin, who are rabbis in the Beis Din, who have a difference of opinion, they cannot disagree. They have to accept the majority rule. That's it. Even if they have good rationale and great reasons why they believe otherwise. And I'm sure you have this sometimes, perhaps, contemporary times. I don't know exactly how the judicial system works in our country, or I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand exactly how it works, but I'm assuming you still have today, whether there's a jury system or whether it is just the court rulings. Am I just frozen on my computer, or am I frozen on your computer too? My computer, my face just looks frozen.
I've got a
Pardon?
I have no screen. Oh, there you go. You're on.
Okay.
You are frozen.
Am I on?
Are frozen.
I am frozen.
Yeah.
Ay vey. Frozen chosen. Okay, what can we do? So the point is that the verse, our sages are telling us that this isn't just about us as the citizens accepting the laws. The Torah is telling us that we're referring here, and in a sense even more strictly, more severely, because this was a capital crime, for a judge to dissent. Could you believe it? And for what reason? The simple, basic reason is we need to have a united front. That's all. We need to have a united front. It has to be that the sages are in agreement with each other. If we don't have it, the core itself would be diminished, would be a broken system. How could we ever decide Jewish law properly if this would not be the case? Okay, I'm removing myself from the spotlight. Is it any better? Can anyone see? I don't know what's wrong. Why my screen went black. Okay. You'll have to, I'll just put other stuff on the screen. Maybe that's better, so you don't have to see me. So why does the Torah take such a hard line on any kind of dissent? What's wrong with someone having another opinion? That's really where we're going here. And Rambam, he seems to imply that if there's to be any continuity in Jewish tradition, there has to be a united front. There has to be some kind of mechanism for resolving any conflict. And the Torah tells us, Acharei Rabbi Mahates, we have to follow the majority rule. If every person who can make any decisions, every day a zagar, as they say in Yiddish, every opinion is to be followed, we'll never have a Jewish law. How could you ever come up with? And obviously the Torah, it can't be argued with. The Torah is the 613 laws. It's straight up. I'm talking here about rabbinic decisions. Okay, you could study the system of how to decide Jewish law, and now every person decides on making their rulings. What's going to happen? Traditions are, you have yours, I have mine, and we see even today's day and age where we have so many different traditions and customs. So instead of the people of the book, we'll look more like peoples of the bulk winds, right? You can have a whole nation that's spinning off every few years because everybody decides what they want to do. If everybody's deciding to make up the laws themselves, of what significance is the law altogether? What difference does it make? So therefore, the Torah tells us that there is a system. Acharei Rabbi Mahates, you have to follow the majority, depending on which court of Jewish law, whether it was the 71 judges. And it could be very tight, 35, 36. It could be in the 23 judges, 12 to 11. It could be in 3 judges, 2 to 1. Whatever it might be, yes, there might be a dissenter. Yes, you might have a sage who has a difference of opinion, but they have to concede, they have to accept that that's the law because we follow the majority rule. That's the halacha. Is there a question? Rosalind, I see you unmuted. You have a question? Wanted to ask something?
Sorry. No,
worries. Okay, let me just share with you. No worries. If anyone has questions, feel free at any point to unmute yourself. I want to share with you in the words of the Sefer HaChinuch here. Sefer HaChinuch, I've told you many times, it's a book of Jewish laws, a very fascinating work. And he usually gives an explanation for each law. And he says as follows: the rationale offered for this mitzvah in our parsha is that mortal minds, our minds diverge from each other. We all have our different opinions. And many minds will never achieve consensus about anything. Right? Or do they say 2 Jews to be opinions? Are we really going to come to agree with each other? So therefore, Hashem knew that if each individual was given the ability, the power to determine the meaning of the Torah according to their own understanding, what's going to happen? We're going to have all types of disagreement, and you're going to follow this rabbi, everyone's going to dial a heter, follow a rabbi who you like, because that rabbi tells you a law that you want to hear. What are we going to have? It's not going to work. Therefore, our God, master of all wisdom, complemented our Torah, the Torah's emes, Torah of truth, with this mitzvah in our parsha, where we're commanded to follow in accordance with the interpretation as received by our ancient sages, which of course was a masara, was a tradition from generation to generation. This was a tradition that they followed, and that was the way the law had to be interpreted. Ooh, sorry guys, I'm going to have to just reshare my screen because I just messed it up. Hold on a second. Apologies. And okay. So if that were to be the case, that we're going to have constant dissent and constantly different opinions, and everybody says, I got it, and it's my way or the highway, it's never going to work. And that's where our sages said, the Torah tells us the rule is Acher Rabbi Mahatas, we have to follow the sages. Of course, go back to the previous year, how smicha was given. Not every Joe Schmo was able to interpret laws. There was a system, and there was a system of smicha, of rabbinic ordination, which was an unbroken chain of sages until it was broken, which was, I don't remember exactly at what point, but it was after the Bar Kokhba revolt. In fact, the Romans forbade any smicha to continue, because they knew that was a cohesive glue that kept Jewish people together. There was one great sage, forgetting his name, who ordained a whole lot of rabbis, and the Romans said, if anyone gives smicha, that all those rabbis and the entire city in which it's done will be uprooted, they'll all be executed. So what did this great sage do? He went into the wilderness, to no man's land, and he taught and ordained a whole lot of great sages in his time. And when the Romans were coming for him, he told them to flee. They dispersed in all directions. And when they came to get him, they executed him in the most horrible, vicious way. He said when they were done with sticking their spears through him, he was like liquid. They said just through like a sieve. That's how bad they punished him for this. So the point we're making so far is that the importance of maintaining this united halachic front. Without any kind if you didn't have this system, then the whole entirety of Jewish law just wouldn't work. Because yes, you have the 613 commandments of the Torah, which there were people who only accepted those, but you'll never get into the rabbinic enactments of laws, which is important for applying to modern day and age, which is important of interpreting. Like, for example, with his litigation. If I don't accept what this judge said, I'll go to another. It's not going to work. So this was the system, and therefore the teaching of Torah law had to follow, had to adhere to this system, to this tradition. And that's the way it worked. Now, of course, we don't just go about punishing people who disagree with us, and especially a great sage or rabbi. Okay, as we saw before, you have the Zaken Mamre. The laws of the Zaken Mamre only apply to a recognized member of the Sanhedrin, a real competent halachic authority who themselves were great personalities. They had smicha, and they were able to decide on Jewish law. And then they still dissented, then this punishment applied. But as we'll see, there are various conditions that qualify, that need to be met in order for this to happen. For example, he has to actually instruct others to follow his ruling. Just because he has a difference of opinion himself, that doesn't make him liable for punishment. If he says, I disagree with the rest of you sages, and now I'm going to start my own new Jewish tradition, I'm going to teach my followers otherwise, that's where you have trouble. Okay, so there are other, for example, the laws are only triggered while the Sanhedrin are presiding from the regular place, which was in Jerusalem. It was on the property, on the premises of the Holy Temple. If that wasn't met, it wouldn't qualify. If some Joe Schmo gets up and says, I disagree with the rabbis, who are you? You don't have an authority. Nobody's going to follow it. But of course, in instances where they did have a following and they were qualified, that's where there was serious worry of dissent and the diversion of the law. So the question is, how do we understand this? What is the degree of authority that is assigned to the sages in order to have this instance of the Zaken Mamre who dissents, who rebels, who doesn't agree with the sages? And the Mishnah tells us that this law can be triggered in the case of someone who disputes rabbinic opinion regarding the performance of a mitzvah, but not if he disputes an explicit biblical commandment itself. Take for example the mitzvah of tefillin. Okay, the Torah tells us, we say it in Shema every day. So if somebody gets up, even a great sage, and says, don't put on tefillin, you can't argue with the Torah. And we read already in last week's parsha that if a false prophet arises, nobody's going to listen to him. Judaism, we follow the Torah. But what about if it's a rabbinic interpretation of a Torah law? For example, the Torah just tells us you should have totafot benenecha, the phylacteries between your eyes. And then we have the tradition of how many chambers are in the tefillin. Okay? So how many compartments are there? It was decided long ago. You understand the tradition is there's 4 compartments. Now, regardless of another person's opinion, regardless if a person feels that there has to be more than 4, that is already, I think this is where, if I understood the law correctly, this is a zaken mamre. This is a person who feels they could argue with the Torah law. And that's something that cannot be done. That's something we're saying here. If they argue with the Torah law saying there's no such mitzvah of tefillin, who are you to argue with the Torah? We don't. But we're talking about when the person is arguing with the rabbinic law. That's where we have a problem with them. Because they're arguing with the sages. And this is actually a Mishnah. And the Mishnah says, Chaymer b'divrei seifrim midivrei Torah. There's a greater stringency. We're more strict with the words of the sages, those who interpreted Torah law, than regarding the words of Torah itself. And this is, for example, a way demonstrating an example of that. So, if you have a zaken mamre, this elder sage, elder doesn't necessarily mean in biological years. We're talking here about a great sage who disagrees with the other sages. Just a second, somebody's asking if I could turn off my webcam. How will that help? Let's see what happens now. Did it fix anything? I only see my screen. I don't see your screens. My apologies, everyone. I don't know what the problem is.
But the audio is more clearer
Okay.
than.
Okay. What I'll do then is I will just reshare my PowerPoint slides. Okay. Are you all with me, guys? I know this is getting a little bit complex and it's an interesting Torah law. Let's try to understand it. If a person argues with the Torah, they're foolish, but they're not going to get punished for it because nobody will listen to them, nobody will follow them. It's not what we're concerned about. Our concern here is if a great sage disagrees with the other sages. Our parsha tells us that at the end of the day, we have to follow the majority rule because that's the system that the Torah put in place. And now, if there's dissent amongst what the rabbinic sages decided, and there's a lot that's discussed in the Talmud. I can't actually even go into this all right now, so I'm not going to do that. We'll just keep it simple for now. That this is the concern that we have at this moment, and our wonder is why are we so strict about when it comes to interpretation of the rabbinic law? What's the difference between Torah and rabbinic law that we seem to be that much stricter here with rabbinic law in that sense than with the Torah law? Okay, so let's just recap quickly. If we said, if there's a zaken mamre, if there's an elder dissenter who is disagreeing with the sages when it comes to a matter of Jewish law, we said that is something that's unacceptable. And in fact, in our parsha where it says you should not digress from what the sages say right or left, says Rashi in our parsha, even if this judge tells you the right is left and the left is right, meaning if the sages decided, right, we follow what the sages tell us. The point we're saying is the sages of the Sanhedrin carry tremendous weight in their decision of halachic making. Okay, it's quite a powerful law to say it. Rashi's telling us, even if the judge tells you the right is left and left is right, we're following what the sages tell us. It's quite a strong decision that is being made here, that we follow the rabbinic laws. So seeing here, I mean, you look at these words, Rashi's commentary, it's quite a strong and harsh perspective to take. That we have to follow what the sages tell us. So, maybe you would expect a little bit more balance. No? And if one of the sages dissents, not against the Torah, but against the other sages, this is a Zaken Mamre. This is a rebellious elder. This is a rebellious sage, and it's intolerable. We cannot accept what this type of behavior from one of the sages dissenting against the other sages. Just looking here, one of the other commentaries says, what does it mean not to divert right or left? You all remember I gave you a vert last week from the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Shner, so I'm going to share with you just a commentary from the Chida. He says it's not as extreme like Rashi is saying that, the sages tell you right is left and left is right. He's saying the point is, if one knows for certain that the sages are mistaken, okay, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he says then in that instance, you do not have to follow them because you know for certain what the sages are telling you is wrong. It's possible. Now, first of all, we're not talking about modern day rabbis. We're talking here about great sages in history. According to this Chida, he's telling us that in such instances, you don't have to listen if you know that the sage is mistaken. But the point I'm making is that the commentaries are telling us that when one of the sages dissents against the decided opinion of the rest of the sages, this is a Zaken Mamre. This is a sage who we can't, who's not accepted. And there is punishment. Now let me just try to explain it properly. Easy examples that come to mind. Okay, last night I spent some time with my kids. We were out in Pilansburg and we did some stargazing. In fact, we had our ranger who was able to show the kids with his remarkable lights how the stars, which is Venus, which is Jupiter, I don't know how they did it in ancient times. But they certainly had a simple system before they had published calendars, or before you went onto your phone to just check what day's Rosh Chodesh and all that. So what did they do? They would have, you all know, because we had various shurim where we discussed this, they had a system of the Sanhedrin deciding when Rosh Chodesh, when the new month was decided, based on witnesses who spotted the new moon. And if they spotted the new moon and they were valid witnesses and we accepted their testimony, then Rosh Chodesh was declared. Okay, so of course, this was very relevant and important in order to determine when a festival would occur. Okay? Now, the laws are fairly simple. A month on a lunar calendar could either have 29 or 30 days, depending. Today, we have a calendar that tells us, but back then, it depended entirely on when the Sanhedrin had officially declared the start of the next month. Okay, and that would decide next month, for example, this is the story I'm going to share with you in a moment, of a story from the Gemara. But next month, we have in our calendar, we know Rosh Hashanah is going to be on Monday, September 6th. It starts Monday evening, September 6th, and it will go on the 7th and the 8th, right? And then Yom Kippur, etc. Everything is exactly a calendar. But in those days, you needed the witnesses to tell you if last month would Elul be a 29 or 30-day month. I believe that today Elul is always 29 days. Okay, but back then, you needed the calendar, you needed the sages to tell us. Let me just quickly see if I'm correct on that. Let me look at my calendar. Elul is always 29 days. So the story goes that one time the witnesses came back and the witnesses said they sighted the new moon. I couldn't see the moon last night. We're too early in the month for us to see the moon. But they said they saw it, and I was out in the Clare and Pilansburg. We couldn't see the new moon. That's why you needed two witnesses, and there was a cross-examination and scrutiny. So the sages of the Sanhedrin cross-examined these witnesses, and they determined it was Rosh Chodesh, meaning Rosh Hashanah is upon them, and Yom Kippur will be 10 days later. Guess what happened? One of the great sages in the Sanhedrin at the time who was it? Rabbi Yeshua, I think it was Rabbi Shimon Levi, I'm not sure. He said, no, I don't trust these witnesses. And if I don't trust these witnesses, or I'm not sure if that was his reason or he had some other reason, but he had his doubts and he was not willing to accept that it was Rosh Hashanah. He said Elul would be 30 days, and according to his interpretation, Yom Kippur would be 1 day later. Now, what's going to happen now? Just imagine that the sages of the Sanhedrin, Rabbi Gamliel, who is the Nasi, the leader, accepted this ruling, but one of his great rabbis, one of his followers, Rabbi Yeshua, says, no. Imagine what a split that would cause in the Jewish people if one of the sages would not accept it. So here you have a perfect example in the Talmud of a person who doesn't want to accept the ruling. Now, if he were to break away from the Beis Din of the ruling, what would happen? He would be a Zaken Mamre. He would be a rebellious elder. And his colleagues turned to him and said, we can't have such a situation. In fact, Rabbi Gamliel the Nasi, who was, you'll see, he calls himself my student, and he said to him, he put his foot down, he said, this is not acceptable. We cannot have this situation. We certainly cannot have that we're going to have a dissenting view here. And the Gemara tells us, this is in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, it's actually not the Gemara, the Mishnah, it says that Rabbi Gamliel sent, I guess, a delegation to Rabbi Yeshua, and they said, on the day that you believe it's Yom Kippur, you are decreed, we rule that you come in a public desecration. I know Yom Kippur, it's the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. You're going to follow the day that we said it's Yom Kippur. And you're going to show that on the day that you believe, that you're convinced should be Yom Kippur, you are going to publicly display that you disagree with it. Meaning, I don't know, we're going to go to Sun City that day. We're going to do something that's not allowed on Yom Kippur. You're going to have a drink in the public. I mean, that's not what he said. The clear words he said to him was, I want you to come with your staff and your money. Very simple. You're publicly declaring that even though you believe it's Yom Kippur, you're following what the sages say, and you're going to observe Yom Kippur that day, the day that they say. And he listened. Okay, he came to the Sanhedrin that day, and he did exactly because, as we learn in our parsha, the law has to follow what the sages decide. Which sages? He might have had a very good opinion and reason why he felt that it wasn't Rosh Chodesh, that he didn't trust those witnesses, or he was better at astronomy or whatever, and he didn't believe that it was Rosh Hashanah yet. But that would undermine the entire system of Jewish law, because the system of Jewish law is that the calendar is ultimately decided by the sages, and you have to follow what they said. And the Gemara tells us that he was comforted, he was consoled by one of his colleagues, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to him that I have with what to teach, and all that Rabbi Gamliel did, meaning, just a second, ladies and gents.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you want to run out now after this, or should I run out because you're going to hang out here?
I'm not going to hang out here, but I'm not going to be ready to leave for a good 20 minutes.
Okay, so maybe I'll take them. So I'm just leaving them. I'm leaving everybody else at home.
Fine.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. So even if you have good, valid reasons why you felt that it's not yet time to celebrate Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah, which thereby Yom Kippur as your calculation, Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Yeshua. He said to him, the verse says, Elem Ma'adeh Hashem Ashatikru Osam. You know when the festivals of God are declared? By you, by the people. That means the sages are the ones to declare when a holiday will be, based on their calculation, based on their system. And if the system is that they scrutinize and cross-examine witnesses, etc., that's the system. And that's what we have to follow, even though you have good reasons to feel otherwise. So this is I don't want to go into all the details, so the Gemara goes on further. It says, when Rabbi Yeshua came to Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Dosa said to him, if we're to question the decisions of the court of Rabbi Gamliel, then we also have to question the decisions of all the courts that stood before that, all the way up to Moses. Because if you think about it, if every sage had a different reason or opinion of what's going to happen to Jewish law, And that's why, even though you have very good reasons why you feel you're correct, you have to follow the rule of following the majority. And Rabbi Gamliel kissed Rabbi Yehoshua and said to him, thank you. He called him my teacher and my disciple. My teacher, he said, in wisdom, and my disciple, and that you accepted my words, even though you have good reason not to. So clearly, the idea is that our calendar, which we discussed in previous classes, how the calendar works, I'm not going to go on there today, is that it is decided in this way by the court. And their determination is final, it's authoritative, no matter what anyone else thinks, no matter how great of a sage they are. Once the decision was made by the Sanhedrin, we follow it, and that's all. You can't, we can't keep on going and finding different reasons to argue it or to change it. Okay, let me just think quickly. I got a couple other sources here, and I want to think which ones are appropriate to look at. Just something interesting here is these are the designated festivals of God, Asher Tikru Osam, which literally translates that you should declare, but Atem is another way of reading them. So the point is that it's the sages, or the plural, the majority of the court that determines when it is. Anyways, it goes a little bit deeper, but I don't want to focus on that today. I actually want to go to one more famous story in the Gemara, very famous story, which didn't end as well as this one. And that was another colleague of Rabbi Yehoshua. And he was, we'll get to this in a moment. Let me just find the source, what the Gemara tells us, because that's another fascinating story. It's the story about the Achnai oven. And this story, I think, is a very powerful story where one of the sages did not accept, and he was vehement in his opinion that he's got the right perspective. But unfortunately, it didn't end very well until he was on his deathbed. He was excommunicated, and it's very sad. But just to sum up what we discussed here, we basically discussed this concept of the Zaken Mamre, of a sage who dissents, and we said we cannot have that in Jewish law. We have to accept that our Parsha tells us that Achrei Rabbi Mahatas, we follow the majority opinion, and at the end of the day, that's the Torah rule, even if one of the sages feels very strongly otherwise. Okay, so that was, until now, we see that, at least in certain circumstances, rabbinic opinion is it's the majority of the rabbis, and we follow what they tell us. Again, this isn't where sages are debating Torah, they're debating interpretation of Torah, which you could say is the way that the oral law was handed down. But I want to spend just a few minutes in looking at the rulings of the rabbis that do come from Sinai. Okay, and that we're talking about Masorah, tradition. Something interesting here from the Maharal of Prague. He says as follows: it seems to me that all of the exegesis, that means all the commentary, all the way the laws are derived and learned by the sages, is not that they are Torah itself, but that they come from Torah. Mi Sinai, they come from Torah. By way of analogy, he tries to explain it as follows. It's like a builder who completes the construction of a house and left room to install things that the house needs. A wise person then came along, and as he studied the house, he thought, why was the house built in this form? If not to add this particular thing, you start figuring out why the architect of this house built it. And here it was designed in this way. And he goes on, the Maharal is giving us the interpretation of the designer, how the architect designed the house, and how the interior decorator is utilizing the original architectural design and engineering to suit the purposes based on the architect's design. And then you add on all the various adjustments within the framework of what the designer built. Says the Maharal, those things that he added may not be considered part of the structure of the house, but they are integral additions that flow from the study of the house itself. Sometimes the wise person will even explain and clarify what part of the house is to be general living quarters and which is to be bedroom. Okay? I'm not going to go into everything Kievman Maharal is saying. He goes on and basically tells us that everything that every rabbi has ever said, has ever ruled, is derived from the Torah. And some of the rulings, he says, he could find more obviously and clearly in the Torah, and others not so. But the teachings relate to the very body of the Torah and remain part and parcel of it. We say Minhag Yisrael Torah when it comes to customs. It's like Torah because the sages had that authority as our parsha gives them. So he says, just like the features, of a kitchen appliance is telling us you have the intended manufacturer's purpose, right? They tell you how it's to be used. So the same thing, the Torah tells us that the sages are the ones who are to unpack and to interpret and to teach the Torah as it's meant to be interpreted. So just a second, ladies and gents, I need to share with you a few more points, but I did share. Okay, ladies and gents, sorry about that. Seems like I lost a bunch of you just walking in, just going to get the kids set up. All right, let me taking from the Maharal, the way he's telling us is this is the way that God intended it, that the sages would interpret the law. And of course, if you read in the Siddur, we say it every morning before davening, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, perhaps one of the reasons we say this and how Torah law is derived, how it's determined, perhaps is because the Siddur itself, the words that we say in our prayer, are words that were composed by great sages. So we are declaring that we understand that their interpretation of Torah is based on these methods, these rules that we're told. The point I wanted to get at here is that we're asking this question. How the rabbis had authority to decide these laws. And, the very same Torah that tells us to do such, to do X, also tells us to follow the rabbinic interpretation, even if it means that we're to do something else, so to say, X, and this is to do Y. And, this is an important point that Rashi was telling us, to follow what the sages say. Of course, there were others that disagree. They said if it's something that's blatantly against Torah, I go into all that because obviously the Torah has very clearly the 613 commandments of the Torah, and those are clear. The question is, beyond those 613 commandments, all the rabbinic enactments and laws that we follow. So this is something that's deeply discussed, how we got to the laws that we have them today. For example, Hanukkah, which is not part of the original canonized Jewish law and all that. So that is the sages. We say a bracha when we light the menorah, even though it's not a divinely ordained command. But it is divinely ordained in our parsha to follow the instructions of the sages. So they gave us a festival called Hanukkah, and we make a bracha thanking God that the sages gave us this. Of course, since the temple's destruction, there's no Sanhedrin, and there's no longer the ability for sages to give us new laws, and therefore pretty much anything we have today is falling more into the category of custom. Okay, so with that in mind, there's a few more points. Yeah?
Please, will you just replace that previous slide? I was just taking the notes down and I didn't get it all.
There you go.
All
we said here is that you should follow the rabbinic interpretation. That's all. We follow rabbinic interpretation of Torah. That's all we're saying here. Okay, this is not Sinai. I'm sorry. These slides don't mean too much. They are just my way of illustrating a little bit of the ideas that we're discussing and making it a little bit more interesting than just listening to my monotonous voice. That's all. Okay, I want to conclude with a story from the Gemara, a famous story, but it's a story that really I think is going to bring the point home. Okay, but I do have 2 points here, so let me try. So this was just to illustrate the Maharal's point of just, yes, you have the design of the home, and the designer himself, the architect, is telling us, like, God gave us the Torah, and God tells us to follow the words of the sages. So the same thing, the teachings of the sages are followed specifically in the way it's part of the design of Judaism. Okay, I will conclude with 2 points. One is a medrash. I want to read this medrash to you. I found it interesting, and we could look at it, and then we'll end with the story in the Gemara. The medrash says, Shimon ben Bar Abba. Shimon, the son of Abba, said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the words of the sages are as precious as the words of the Torah. What's the reasoning for this? He says, well, the verse says, he quotes a verse here, Matam, Yechikech kiyen hatov. Sorry. And he says it's based on the verse, Ki tovim dodecha miyayin. It's a verse in Shir HaShirim from King Solomon. Your palate is like the best wine. Okay? And he even goes further. Rabbi Yochanan said that the words of the sages are more precious, for your love is better than wine. I have a good way of understanding that, which I'll try to give you in a minute. Says the Gemara even further that the various sages here are going on, and basically this is just how great the sages talk about not just the Torah itself, but the rabbinic interpretation of Torah. Okay, so that's pardon? Yeah, I'm not going to actually hone in too much on that, but perhaps there's 2 ways of looking at this. One idea, one concept is that our sages are telling us that the oral law, as it was coming from Sinai, was so deep, was so great, that it couldn't have been even written down within the Torah itself. That's one commentary that I saw, which I like. It's a fascinating perspective and insight and way of understanding this, that that the Torah, these sages, the rabbinic interpretation is not just rabbinic interpretation. This is the oral law as it was given to Moshe. And it's concealed and implied within the written Torah. But it's so great, it's so deep, that it couldn't be expressed in the Torah, in the written Torah itself. Another one is, you ever spend some time baking? And my wife could bake. Makes really good food. Now, she can make it herself and it'll come out quite perfect. Or she can engage the kids. When she gets the kids involved, even though it doesn't come out as perfect, but let me ask you, which was a more meaningful and enjoyable experience? Is it when she bakes herself, cooks herself, and everything comes out exactly as the recipe says? Or when the kids are involved, and all of a sudden, it's a meaningful and connecting experience? So because I don't have the time to read all the commentaries here, I'm not going to go into all the depth of it. But that's the gist of it. Okay? That A, there's a certain depth to the oral tradition that wasn't included in the written Torah. And B, God wants that our engagement with the Torah. God left certain aspects and elements of Torah, law, raw, for us to be able to interpret, for us to be able to grasp and understand and have a relationship with Hashem. And that was the other point I was going to make. With that in mind, my friends, I'm going to conclude with a story in the Gemara. And this story, as the Talmud puts it, is a story that just illustrates this concept in our parsha of Azak and Mamre. And I think it will help us understand how it is applied. And even though a sage could be very great, at the end of the day, they have to follow the Acharei Rabbim Lahatos, this rule of majority ruling. And it goes as follows. The Gemara asks, my achnai. What is the story of the achnai ovens? I think I'll need a whole shiur to tell you about the achnai ovens, because that was an ancient type of baking system. I can't go into it all now. Let's just understand and accept that it was a certain oven. And the Gemara tells us that there was a debate about this oven. Rabbi Eliezer, he brought forward every imaginable argument, and the sages did not accept his opinion in the rule that they were making about this achnai oven. So he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, I will prove it to you from this carob tree he pointed to. And then the Gemara tells us, you know what happened? The carob tree jumped 100 cubits. 100 cubits is like 50 meters from its place. That's quite a jump. Have you ever see a tree jump? The Gemara says not only that, some of those who witnessed said it jumped even further, 200 meters. And guess what the sages said? Very, very sorry, Rabbi Eliezer. You could have these miracles, but ein mavinin raya min acharob. We cannot prove anything from a carob tree. So he said, oh yes, you have to see that my opinion is correct, because if the halacha agrees with me, then the stream of water will prove it. And guess what happens? The Gemara says, the stream of water began to flow backwards. And again, the sages said, we're very sorry. You can't prove anything with these miracles and wonders. So again he argued, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of this building prove it. They were in the Sanhedrin. And the walls started to shake and they started to move. One of the other great scholars said, hey, hold it there. Don't collapse on us. And the Gemara says, the wall remained like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It didn't fall down, but it didn't go back up. It said, why? In deference to Rabbi Yeshua, in deference to Rabbi Eliezer, the wall started to come down. And in deference to Rabbi Yeshua, who stopped it, told it not to come, so it remained in an incline. Again, the sages said, we're sorry, you can't prove anything from these wonders. So Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. And it was a baskal, a heavenly voice that came out and said that when you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, he knows what he's talking about. And again, the sages said, Torah lo b'shamayim, very sorry, Torah is not in heaven. And unfortunately, the Gemara concludes that they told him, that the halacha is very clear in our parsha. We follow the sages based on the ruling of following the majority. And therefore, they saw that he was so determined to declare that the halacha should be like him, they banned him, they excommunicated him. It's a very sad story in that sense. But all of this underscores the extraordinary power of rabbinic interpretation, because if not for that, we would have Jewish anarchy. Everybody would decide the law based on themselves, and you can't even have the greatest sages. It goes by majority opinion, and this is what the Torah tells us. So yes, there's a difference between Torah and rabbinic law, absolutely. And there are laws that have to be followed on how the rabbinic laws are determined and decided. And this is one of them that we learned today. One of those is the way the sages learn the laws, and it's following the majority opinion, and that's how the Jewish law carries the tremendous weight that it does. So with that, my friends, that is the concept that I wanted to share with you today, just to give you a little bit of a taste of the sages' interpretation of law and how it's implemented, how it's decided. And I hope I hope you learned and appreciated somewhat of this interesting journey that we took. I think there's a lot more that could be said, a lot more that could be learned and studied, but that was just a little bit of what I was able to share with you today. Any questions before we go? Okay, with that in mind, I wish you all a pleasant, wonderful day. Sei gesund. See you tomorrow.